a man convinced his entire household that he was God on earth, and for nearly 2 years they let him decide who they would marry, what they could eat, and whether a sick man was allowed to see a doctor. His name was Robert Matthias, and not many years before that, he had been nothing more than a carpenter who could not keep a shop open. He was born in 17 in Cambridge, a small town in Washington County, New York, the youngest of 10 children, and orphaned at 7. Elders of a strict anti-burgher Presbyterian congregation raised him, trained him as a carpenter, and as a grown man he ran a store that failed, then failed again. The second shop shuttered just like the first. 2 of his own children died young, and somewhere in those same hard years, his marriage to a woman named Margaret quietly came apart. By 1831, he had left Albany behind, was preaching on street corners in Rochester and in New York City, and had taken a new name for himself, the prophet Matthias, telling anyone who would stop that he was the father of a kingdom on earth, and that the old churches had nothing left to teach him. A small, devoted handful of people were willing to call him that to his face. Most who heard him on those corners dismissed him outright. A few did not. Inside the house he came to rule, a man would die simply for obeying him. Stories like his tend to vanish from memory. If this one is new to you, liking the video and subscribing helps bring more of them back. 2 years before he ever heard the name Matthias, Elijah Pearson was one of the most respected religious reformers in New York City. He came down from a line of New England Puritans. An ancestor of his had led a Puritan migration that founded Newark in 1666, and his own father had served as a trustee of the family's church in New Jersey. He apprenticed as a clerk in Manhattan as a young man and went into business with a partner named John Steinbrenner. By the time he was 34, he owned his own firm on Pearl Street, doing business with merchants up and down the eastern seaboard. His charity went well beyond his own congregation. Missions, a rescue effort for women on the streets of the 5 Points slum that handed out food, clothing, and Bibles to women the rest of the city preferred not to see. A school for poor children. He prayed, by his own account, in the belief that God answered him in plain English, and preferred to do this work quietly, without the kind of public notice other reformers sought, which made his later transformation all the harder for old friends to reconcile. But there was something the neighbors could not square. He and his wife, Sarah, the daughter of a respected city preacher, who also served as chaplain to several of New York's charitable and penal institutions, had fallen in with a movement that called itself retrenchment, which held that comfort itself was a kind of sin. A prosperous merchant and his wife lived on bread and water, fasted for days at a time, and kept a house with almost nothing in it. In 1830, Sarah fell ill and died. Pearson refused to accept it. Before a small gathering of followers, he stood over her body and tried to call her back to life, repeating one line of scripture again and again: "The Lord shall raise him up." He kept on for the better part of an hour, until her own father, a minister himself, stepped forward and quietly brought it to an end. That same year, even grieving, Pearson helped found an independent church on Bowery Hill, built on a doctrine called perfectionism, the belief that a true believer could become entirely free of sin in this life, not merely forgiven of it. It was an unusually demanding doctrine for an unusually demanding year. After that, he let his business go and let his hair and beard grow long. He was a man with a door standing open, though he did not yet know who would walk through it. In May 1832, the man now calling himself the prophet Matthias came to call on Pearson. He was, by then, impossible to overlook on the streets he had chosen for his mission. In public, he wore a green military coat lined with silk, a crimson sash, ruffles at his wrists, and he carried an iron rod with which, he said, he meant to rule the world. He preached against the clergy and against women, and, by one account, would not abide a man who wore spectacles. Most people who heard him laughed or walked on. Pearson did not. The two men found something neither could treat as coincidence. Each had marked the same day, the 20th of June, 1830, as the day God had spoken to him directly. Pearson had been riding an omnibus through the city when it happened. An ordinary errand turned, in his own telling, into a summons from God, a voice that told him, "Thou art Elijah the Tishbite. Gather unto me all the members of Israel at the foot of Mount Carmel." For Matthias, the date marked something stranger still. That same day, after a vision of a coming flood, he had fled Albany with his 3 sons, was found by a search party in the town of Argyle, judged temporarily insane, and held for 2 weeks in the Albany almshouse before being released. They took the matching dates as proof. The following Sunday, Pearson handed his pulpit to Matthias and stepped down. He would never preach again. Matthias was not an unusual figure for his time. A wave of religious revivals, later called the Second Great Awakening, had been sweeping through the state for over a decade. Itinerant preachers, such as Charles Grandison Finney, drew crowds in the thousands to outdoor camp meetings, promising sudden transformation to anyone willing to come forward. Revival promised renewal to everyone alike, but it was almost always men who stood at the front of the tent, and women who were told what their own renewal should look like. In western New York, the revivals came so often and overlapped so completely that newspapers later called the region the burned-over district, ground that religious fire had passed over again and again until there was almost nothing left to burn. It was in that same district, in those same years, that a young farmer named Joseph Smith was gathering followers of his own around a new book of Scripture. It was a hopeful, unsettled time when ordinary people were told that the old churches had grown cold and that a new word might come from anywhere. Out of that ferment came real reform, the movement against slavery among it, but also men who claimed to speak for God and were believed. There was one more new thing in the city in those years. A cheap, scandal-hungry kind of newspaper, soon known as the penny press, was just being born, and it lived on exactly this sort of story. The stranger and more shameful, the better. Cases like this one fed an appetite the new papers were only beginning to learn how to satisfy. By 1833, the household had a permanent home. Benjamin and Anne Folger, an established and devout New York couple, had bought a country place 30 miles up the Hudson, 29 acres of land they called Hart Place, in the same valley where a Methodist campground near the village of Sing Sing drew thousands of worshipers every summer. Revival was nothing new to that stretch of the river. Visited, decided it was the ground his kingdom would stand on, and renamed it Mount Zion. He moved his followers in and settled himself as father of the house, in a building that stood on a rise above the river with a long porch and a view that gave no hint of what its new owner had planned for it. From the road, neighbors saw nothing unusual, just a well-kept farmhouse like any other in the valley. They had no way of knowing what went on inside it. He ruled the household completely, assigning each person's work and place according to what he claimed to see in their spirit. The household followed the same retrenchment. Pearson and Sarah had once practiced alone. Plain food, plain dress, long hours of prayer, except now an entire household answered to one man's say over how strictly each rule was kept. He called certain unions match spirits, a doctrine that held every soul had exactly one true match somewhere in the world, and that he alone, as father, could see who matched whom. Anne Folger was told she was the mother of a spiritual generation, that her marriage to Benjamin no longer counted, and that she was his own match spirit, destined to bear a holy child. She agreed. Almost nothing survives about who Anne Folger had been before any of this. The record picks her up already inside the household, already remade. Catherine Galloway, a widow and one of the prophet's most devoted followers, was declared Benjamin's match spirit and married to him by decree. He soon left her and turned back to Anne. One woman in the house did not move. She had come into the household as Pearson's own servant, assigned to Matthias when he first arrived, and she had already lived through more loss than most people there could imagine. Born into slavery in the Hudson Valley and sold from one owner to another, she spoke only Dutch until she was 9 years old. She had escaped once already, in the last days of 1826, slipping away with her infant daughter, Sophia, to the home of a family named Isaac and Maria van Wagenen, whose own surname she took the following July, when New York's law finally freed the state's remaining slaves. After that, she had done something almost no one in her position dared. She went to court and won back her older son, Peter, who had been sold illegally to a man in Alabama. Now, in this house, she carried the cooking, the washing, and the early fires, while the father and the mother of the kingdom slept late, and she resented being thrown behind in her own chores by people who did none. A visitor to the house, watching marriages made and unmade at the prophet's word, put it plainly. There was, he said, too much changing of wives here. Matthias sent Benjamin to Albany to bring back his own children from his former life. On the road home, Benjamin became intimate with the prophet's married daughter, Isabella Laysdell. When it came out, Matthias struck her, and then, after some thought, declared that she and Benjamin were match spirits as well, and married them, though she already had a husband. He had done this twice before in the same house, and each time, the people it touched had simply gone along with it. That husband, Charles Laysdell, would not accept it. He came to Mount Zion, found his wife on the long porch overlooking the river, and demanded she come home with him. When the kingdom refused, he went outside it, to the law, his complaint reaching the same Westchester County office that would soon be asked to look into Pearson's death as well. In the New York of that time, a legal marriage could not be dissolved by anything short of adultery proven in court. Whatever this household above the Hudson believed, the kingdom was already straining under that pressure when its members sat down to supper one evening near the end of July. On the 28th of July, 1834, 4 people sat down to that supper: Matthias, Pearson, Anne Folger, and Catherine Galloway. It was the height of a Hudson Valley summer, the kind of heat that made the berries ripen early that year. Pearson had not been well for some time. The nervous fits that had troubled him in the city had grown worse at Mount Zion, frequent and severe enough that he could not safely be left alone. For weeks the household had taken turns sitting with him through his worst spells, never once sending for a doctor. Matthias had decided that Pearson's affliction was the work of what he called fitty devils, spirits that had to be driven out by prayer. And Pearson, who trusted him, agreed. Supper at Mount Zion began and ended, as every meal there did, with prayer led by Matthias himself. At the end of the meal, he served out blackberries. He and Pearson had picked together that same afternoon. What happened next is worth setting down plainly, because it became the whole of the case that would soon grip the city. Anne Folger ate 2 berries. Catherine Galloway finished her plate. Pearson ate his and asked for a second helping. Matthias ate none at all. By about 4 o'clock the next afternoon, Pearson collapsed, violently ill. Once again, Matthias forbade any doctor, any medicine, any help of any kind, and once again Pearson said that prayer alone would save him. So there was no doctor, no one was sent for. He was carried to a room and left there, untended, through the long summer night, while the household slept. In the morning, Anne Folger told the others that Elijah Pearson was dead. He left no children behind, and no wife either. Sarah had been dead 4 years by then. The household that buried him was the only family he had left, the same household that had refused him a doctor. He had helped build the very kingdom that let him die inside its rules. But he died alone, in the dark, of an illness no one was permitted to treat, in a house full of people who called themselves his family. Whatever the blackberries were or were not, that much is plain. A sick man asked for nothing but prayer, and prayer was all he was given. The kingdom did not survive him long. Word of the death spread through the valley quickly, and within days, Westchester County had sent men to open both Pearson's body and the household's books. Within weeks, the fellowship had dissolved into a fight over money and property. Exactly who owned Mount Zion was never entirely settled. Folger said Pearson had deeded the property to him before his death. The county's own filings suggested it had gone the other way, from Folger to Pearson. Either way, with Pearson dead, neither man's claim was simple anymore. Benjamin Folger, who had funded the whole enterprise and lost his wife and his fortune inside it, turned on the prophet and set out to destroy him. Among those drawn in early was a merchant named Sylvester Mills, who had given money and supplies to outfit the prophet's mission. When the kingdom collapsed, Mills's own alarmed friends had him committed to an asylum, where he remained long after Matthias himself walked free. Folger also needed someone else to carry the blame, and he chose the person in the house with the least power to fight back. It had started over something small. One morning, the coffee Isabella served tasted bitter, and within Mount Zion's small, suspicious world, bitter coffee was enough to plant an idea that would later nearly cost her everything. Folger began to say that Isabella, the servant, had once tried to poison him and his family. He was betting on something he believed about the world he lived in, that a jury would never take a black woman's word over his own. The new scandal sheets did the rest. Papers as far away as Boston and Philadelphia picked up the story within days. Readers who had never heard of Sing Sing now knew its name, alongside words like harem and imposture, used freely and without much concern for accuracy. Some accounts claimed Matthias kept a dozen wives. Others said he had murdered more than one follower before Pearson. Almost none of it was true, but by then the story did not need to be true to spread. One of the men who would shape how the country remembered all of this was William Leete Stone, editor of the New York Commercial Advertiser. Stone had crossed paths with Matthias once before, in a boarding house, and had been alarmed by him. After the trial, he joined the Folgers to write a book that laid the kingdom's sins on Isabella and cast the wealthy couple as innocents led astray. In his public life, Stone was a known supporter of the gradual end of slavery. Reporters from several city papers, his own among them, would soon fill the press bench every day of the trial to come. No one was ever convicted of killing Elijah Pearson. Matthias's defense was led by a lawyer named Henry Western, a man who would soon find himself representing the very servant the prosecution wanted to blame instead. The trial opened in White Plains and lasted 4 days in a courtroom packed with the curious from the first morning. On the first day, Matthias was held in contempt for an outburst at the grand jury, and the judge, Charles Ruggles, paused to decide whether the prophet was even fit to stand trial. Ruggles accepted the word of Matthias' own brother-in-law, who said the man was insane on religion, but sound on everything else. To escape trial altogether, the judge ruled a man would have to be insane on all subjects. Matthias did not qualify. While he awaited trial, he kept prophesying from his cell, predicting a great freeze, after which he would rule the world. The prosecution's theory was simple enough, that those who controlled what Pearson ate and what medicine he received had let him die, and that the timing, a day after he had eaten from the very same dish as everyone else, was too convenient to be coincidence. 2 doctors had examined Pearson's body and declared he had been poisoned, and that declaration was the seed of everything. But a third man, the one who had actually tested the contents of Pearson's stomach, took the stand and said plainly that he had found no poison at all. Under cross-examination, the first doctor's findings came apart in their hands. Ann Folger testified for the better part of 6 hours, printed at length in the papers the next morning. She never quite said the words, but she let the jury feel that Pearson had been poisoned, and that the prophet and his servant had done it. It nearly worked. The judge ruled there was not enough evidence to convict anyone of murder, and the charge was dropped. The blackberries that had frightened a city turned out to be only blackberries. One charge held, and it was not the one the newspapers cared about. The state had also charged Matthias with whipping his married daughter. Charles Laisdell testified that he had never forgiven him, and Ruggles told the jury that whatever a father's power over a child might once have been, he lost it the day she married. On that, and only that, Matthias was found guilty and sentenced to 3 months in the county jail. His 30 days for contempt were added on top, so that by the time he walked free, autumn had already turned to winter. Isabella did not wait to see whether the rumor would settle on her. She went to Henry Western, the same lawyer who had just defended Matthias, and began gathering letters from former employers vouching for her honesty. She did not deny the accusation by raising her voice. She denied it by producing names. The letters, drawn from households across the city where she had worked long before ever meeting Matthias, spoke to her honesty, her steadiness, and her care of the children left in her charge. She gathered several such letters, more documentation than Folger's rumor ever had behind it. Catherine Galloway, who had once been declared a match spirit and then set aside, came forward as well, confirming under questioning that the marriages inside Mount Zion had been entered into freely, not by force. In the same weeks, she quietly helped Margaret, the wife Matthias had abandoned years before in Albany, find lawyers of her own. Margaret had stayed behind for years, unable under New York law to divorce a husband who had committed no adultery she could prove, raising what remained of their family without him. Few of the people who had once depended on the prophet were inclined to help anyone he had wronged. Isabella did it anyway. A handful of Margaret's letters to Western survive today in an archive in Michigan, among the only documents to survive from a household that otherwise left almost nothing behind. Matthias served his sentence and went west. In November of 1835, calling himself Joshua, the Jewish minister, he turned up in Kirtland, Ohio, and called on Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon Church. The two men dined together, each taking the measure of the other, and parted ways, with each declaring the other possessed by the devil. Matthias drifted on, and is thought to have died in the Iowa Territory around 1841, leaving no grave that anyone has ever found. Mount Zion itself did not last much longer as anyone's kingdom. The land later became part of a grand estate called Beechwood, and today an apartment building stands roughly where the household once did, with no marker for what happened there. Isabella did not simply clear her name. On Henry Western's advice, she sued Benjamin Folger for slander and won. The court ordered him to pay her $125. Years earlier, she had gone to court to win back her son. Now she had gone to court to win back her name, and she is said to have explained her reasoning plainly. She had the truth, and she meant to crush them with the truth. It did not end the way it should have. Stone's book, titled Matthias and His Impostures, appeared within months and sold briskly, written with the easy authority of a respected New York editor. Anne remade herself as a Christian woman, led astray by religious excess, and walked back into respectable society. Gilbert Vale, a British freethinker who had left London years before in the unrest that followed the Peterloo Massacre, wrote the answer, a book called Fanaticism, built from Isabella's own telling. Vale combed the public record for what he called white evidence, corroboration from white witnesses, because he knew a black woman's word alone would not be weighed the same in print. By the time his book reached readers, the public had already moved on to fresher scandals, and the woman who had won her case in a court of law was in the pages people actually read, still written down as the villainess of Mount Zion. Of what became of her marriage to Benjamin after that, almost nothing further was recorded. Catherine Galloway, the widow who had stood by Isabella at the end of it, passes out of the record. After that, her later life undocumented. Historians who studied the case in the decades since have generally concluded that Pearson had probably not been poisoned at all, that a sick man had simply been left to die by people who believed prayer was a sufficient substitute for medicine. Isabella went back to working as a servant. She had lost nearly everything she owned inside the kingdom, and she carried what it had taught her quietly for years. Then, in 1843, she told the family she worked for that the Spirit had called her and that she could not stay. She left her old name behind her and spent the rest of her life speaking across the country for the abolition of slavery and for the rights of women, becoming one of the most quoted reformers of her age. Years later, on a Boston stage, when a speaker's despair over slavery threatened to turn a meeting hopeless, she would interrupt with 4 words that are still quoted today: "Frederick, is God dead?" In her later years, she supported her work by selling photographs of herself, captioned with the words, "I sell the shadow to support the substance." She died in 1883 in Battle Creek, Michigan, having spent 4 decades as one of the most recognized reformers in the country. He had once said he carried a sword that came from the one who was first and last, and an iron rod with which he would rule the world. Neither saved him from disappearing without a trace. The man who once told a houseful of people that he was God ended his life unremembered, in a territory that does not even mark his grave. The servant who carried his fires and his washing, the one person in that house his word never moved, is the one history still calls by name: Sojourner Truth. If you hadn't heard her story told this way before, I'd like to know in the comments.